14 days before his wedding, Ethan Cole stood in the middle of his grandmother's dining room and heard 6 words that would destroy everything his family had planned. "I will choose your bride myself." Not his mother, not him, not the woman already wearing a diamond on her finger, already ordering invitations with her name printed in gold letters. His grandmother, a woman everyone thought was simply old, simply sentimental, simply tired, looked around the table with eyes that had not softened in 80 years and said it again, slower this time, so no one could pretend they misheard. "It is Cole family tradition, and I am the last one alive who remembers why." Vanessa Whitmore's fork froze halfway to her mouth. Diane Cole's smile cracked at the edges, and in the kitchen doorway a maid named Maria Alvarez stood holding a tray of coffee cups, completely invisible to everyone in that room. She had no idea that in 14 days she would be the reason for a scandal 40 years in the making. She had no idea her own mother's name was about to come back from the dead. And Ethan Cole, a man who had built an empire out of not trusting anyone, had no idea he was about to fall in love with the one person standing in his house that he had never once truly looked at.
Before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe to Amazing Folktale, but only if you genuinely connect with this story. Hype up the video. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what your local time is in the comments below. I love seeing how these stories connect people from all around the world. Let's get started.
Ethan Cole was 34 years old, and by every measure the world used to judge success, he had already won. He controlled Cole Industries, a logistics and technology empire his grandfather had started with 3 trucks and a handshake. Under Ethan, it had grown into something that touched 4 continents. Magazines called him the quiet billionaire because he never gave interviews, never posted photos of yachts, never let a camera catch him smiling in public. People who didn't know him assumed that meant he was cold. The people who did know him knew something different. They knew Ethan didn't trust easily because trust, in his life, had always come with a price tag attached. His father had left when Ethan was 6 years old, walking out of a modest house in Ohio with a suitcase and a woman who was not his mother, and never coming back. His mother, Diane, had spent the years after that trying to survive, and later, once money entered the picture, trying to control. Ethan had grown up watching his mother smile at people she despised because they were useful to her, and frown at people who loved her because they weren't. The person who raised him really raised him, in the way that shapes a person's soul, was his grandmother, Eleanor Cole. When Ethan was 8, his mother sent him to spend a summer with Eleanor, while she figured things out. That summer became a year. That year became most of his childhood. Eleanor didn't have much money back then. The Cole fortune came later, built slowly through Ethan's own relentless work in his 20s. But she had something rarer. She had patience. She had honesty. She never once told Ethan a comfortable lie. "The truth is heavier to carry," she used to tell him, "but a lie will break your back later when you're not looking." Ethan carried that sentence with him into every boardroom he ever walked into. By the time he was 26, he had turned a struggling shipping division into the backbone of a billion-dollar company. By 30, Forbes had put his photo on a cover with the headline, "The Man Who Doesn't Smile." By 32, he had more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes, and fewer people he actually trusted than he had fingers on one hand. His grandmother was one of them. Maybe the only one, some days. Which is why, when Eleanor moved permanently into his estate 2 years ago, officially because the guest house is more peaceful than my old apartment, unofficially because Ethan quietly insisted on it once her health started slipping, he never questioned her presence in his home. He built her a private wing. He hired the best doctors. He made sure the household staff treated her like the true head of the family, because in every way that mattered, she was. What Ethan didn't know, what nobody in that house knew, except Eleanor herself, was that his grandmother was carrying a secret so old it had outlived almost everyone who could have exposed it. A secret about a debt she owed. A debt with a name attached to it. And that name was about to walk into his house wearing an apron. Ethan believed he was in control of his own life. He believed the wedding to Vanessa Whitmore, the merger of 2 powerful families, the perfectly choreographed engagement photos. He believed believed all of it was his decision. He had no idea his grandmother had already made a different decision, one that had been 40 years in the making, one that had absolutely nothing to do with Vanessa Whitmore, and everything to do with a young nurse who had saved Eleanor's life decades before Ethan was even born. Maria Alvarez had been working in the Cole household for 11 months, and in that time almost no one had asked her a single question about her life. She was 29 years old. She kept her dark hair pulled back in a tight bun so it wouldn't fall into her face while she worked. She moved through the enormous house quietly, efficiently, the way people move when they've learned that being noticed is usually more dangerous than being invisible. 3 years earlier, Maria had been in her final year of medical school. She doesn't talk about that anymore, not because she's ashamed of it, but because saying it out loud always brings the same reaction: pity or disbelief, or worse, the assumption that she must have failed, must have been lazy, must not have wanted it badly enough. None of that was true. What was true was simpler and crueler than anything a person chooses for themselves. Her mother, Rosa Alvarez, had worked her entire life as a home health nurse, taking private jobs for families who paid in cash and rarely said thank you. Rosa had raised Maria alone after Maria's father passed away when Maria was 4. Every dollar Rosa earned went into one thing: her daughter's education. Rosa never took a vacation. Rosa never remarried, though she had chances. Rosa wore the same 3 cardigans in rotation for 15 years, because new clothes were money that could instead become Maria's tuition. "You are going to be a doctor," Rosa used to say, tucking Maria into bed even when Maria was far too old to be tucked in. "And when you are, you will save people the way I never could save enough of them." In Maria's 3rd year of medical school, Rosa was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. It had already spread by the time the doctors found it. Maria took a leave of absence to care for her. Of course she did, there was never a question. And within 8 months, Rosa Alvarez was gone. What Rosa left behind was not just grief. It was debt, medical bills that insurance hadn't covered, a small apartment with months of back rent, a funeral that had to be paid for somehow. Maria sold what little her mother owned, took out loans against her own name, and delayed her return to medical school by 1 semester. Then 2, then indefinitely, because by then the debt had grown claws, and every entry-level job Maria could find with an incomplete medical degree paid barely enough to survive, let alone finish school. So Maria did what people do when survival and dreams can no longer occupy the same sentence. She let the dream wait. She told herself it was temporary. She took a job as household staff for a wealthy family 2 states away from the life she used to imagine for herself, because the pay was steady, and the room and board meant she could finally start paying down what her mother's illness had cost. She had been doing it for 3 years now, first for another family, then, 11 months ago, for the Coles. Maria never complained. She was the first one awake in the house, and often the last to finish. She remembered which of the household staff had a sick child at home, and quietly covered their shifts. She left small kindnesses in her wake without asking for credit: an extra blanket on a cold night for the older groundskeeper, a warm meal saved for the night shift security guard. And every single night, in the small staff quarters at the back of the estate, Maria kept a single photograph on her nightstand. It was the only photograph she had of her mother from her mother's younger years. Rosa, in a crisp white nurse's uniform, standing outside a building Maria didn't recognize, smiling in a way Maria had rarely seen in person. She had no idea that the woman standing 3 feet to Rosa's left in that photograph, cropped out by time and a worn edge, was a young Eleanor Cole. She had no idea her mother's name was written somewhere in this very house, in a ledger nobody had opened in 40 years. She simply believed she was invisible, a maid, someone whose story had already ended before it began. She was wrong. Her story was about to become the center of everything. Vanessa Whitmore did not think of herself as a villain. She thought of herself as someone who understood how the world actually worked, unlike the people around her who still believed in fairy tales. She was 28, striking in the deliberate way that came from a lifetime of careful investment: the right trainer, the right dermatologist, the right stylist who knew exactly which shade of blonde photographed best. Her family, the Whitmores, had once been just as wealthy as the Coles. Once, before a series of bad investments and one very public scandal involving Vanessa's father had quietly eroded most of what they had. What remained was the appearance of wealth, propped up carefully, and a daughter who had been raised since childhood to understand one lesson above all others: marry well, and everything else fixes itself. She met Ethan Cole at a charity gala 3 years ago. She had researched him for weeks before that night: his habits, his schedule, the exact charity board he was expected to sit on, the exact conversation conversation topics that made him relax his guard. It wasn't manipulation, she told herself. It was preparation. Everyone prepares for things they want, and it worked. Ethan, who trusted almost no one, found Vanessa easy to be around precisely because she never asked him hard questions, never pushed at the walls he'd built. She complimented his work ethic. She never mentioned his father. She fit seamlessly into the life he already had, which felt, to a tired and guarded man, like relief. What Ethan didn't see, what few people saw, because Vanessa was careful to only let them see it in small, deniable doses, was how she treated people she considered beneath her. The first sign came only 2 weeks into their engagement, so small that even the staff who witnessed it barely mentioned it. Vanessa asked Maria to re-iron a tablecloth 3 times because the folds weren't sharp enough, standing over her the entire time with her arms crossed, saying nothing, just watching. It wasn't about the tablecloth. Vanessa wanted Maria to understand where she stood. The second sign came when Vanessa learned the household staff had been given the afternoon off for a local holiday. She personally overruled it, informing the house manager that guests are coming and I don't care what day it is. When one of the younger staff members quietly mentioned it was a family tradition for many of them, Vanessa's response was simple: then they can have traditions on their own time. She was never cruel in front of Ethan. She was never cruel in front of Eleanor, not directly. She had learned, over a childhood of watching her own mother navigate wealthy circles, exactly how far unkindness could go before it left a visible mark, and she never crossed that line where anyone with power could see it. But she had already begun printing wedding invitations with her name embossed in gold, weeks before Ethan had formally proposed a date, because in Vanessa's mind, the outcome was never in question. The Cole fortune, the Cole name, the security her own family so desperately needed, all of it was simply a matter of time and patience. She had not counted on Eleanor Cole. When Eleanor announced at that dinner that she alone would choose Ethan's bride, Vanessa's first reaction, hidden behind a practiced smile, was not fear. It was irritation. The irritation of someone who believes a formality is being needlessly inserted into an already settled outcome. It would take her 10 more days to understand that it was not a formality at all. And by then, she would have already made the first of several choices that would slowly, methodically, unravel everything she'd spent years building. The morning after Eleanor's announcement, the household staff were told that Eleanor Cole would be moving into the guest house to observe the family more closely during this important time. Nobody questioned an 82-year-old woman wanting closer proximity to her family during her grandson's engagement. What they didn't know was that Eleanor had a very specific reason for wanting to be near the daily rhythm of the house, near the staff, near the small moments that revealed a person's true character far more accurately than any dinner conversation ever could. 2 days after moving in, Eleanor made a request that seemed unremarkable on paper. She asked that Maria Alvarez be assigned as her personal attendant for the duration of her stay. Meals, tea, small errands, company in the afternoons. The house manager approved it without a second thought. Maria was reliable, quiet, and good with elderly clients. She had, after all, cared for her own mother through a terminal illness, though nobody in this house knew that. Maria herself was nervous the first morning she brought tea to Eleanor's room. Eleanor Cole had a reputation in the household, not for cruelty, but for a kind of sharpness that made people choose their words carefully around her. "Sit down," Eleanor said, the moment Maria set the tray on the table. Maria hesitated. "I don't think I'm supposed to." "I didn't ask what you're supposed to do. I asked you to sit." Maria sat. What followed was not the polite, distant small talk Maria expected from a woman of Eleanor's stature. Eleanor asked her real questions. Where are you from? Where did your mother grow up? What was she like? Did she work? What did she do? Maria answered carefully at first, giving short, safe answers, the way she'd learned to with employers who asked personal questions mostly out of boredom, rather than real interest. But Eleanor kept asking, and something in the specificity of her questions, not, "Tell me about your family," but "Did your mother ever work in nursing, in hospitals, anything like that?" made Maria's chest tighten slightly, though she couldn't have said why. "She was a home health nurse," Maria finally said, "for almost 30 years. Something shifted in Eleanor's face, just barely, a flicker, gone as quickly as it appeared. "What was her name?" Eleanor asked, very quietly. "Rosa," Maria said. "Rosa Alvarez." Eleanor said nothing for a long moment. Then she simply nodded, picked up her tea, and changed the subject entirely, as though the question had never been asked. Maria left that conversation confused, carrying a strange, unplaceable feeling that something important had just happened without her understanding what. She had no way of knowing that 3 floors above, in a locked drawer in her private study, Eleanor kept an old leather ledger, the kind used decades ago to record hospital shift assignments, with a single name written in fading ink on a page from 40 years earlier. Rosa Alvarez, night nurse, St. Agnes Hospital. Eleanor had spent 4 decades wondering if that young nurse was even still alive. Now, sitting 3 feet from her, was the answer to a question she had never stopped asking. Meanwhile, Vanessa was noticing something too. Not the emotional undercurrent between Eleanor and the maid, but the simple, irritating fact that Eleanor was spending an unusual amount of time with staff instead of with her. When Vanessa tried to visit the guest house to catch up, Eleanor was conveniently unavailable 3 separate times. "She's testing something," Vanessa told her mother on the phone that night. "I don't know what, but she's testing something and I don't like not knowing what it is." Her mother's advice was simple, and it was advice Vanessa would come to regret taking so literally in the days ahead. Then find out, whatever it takes. By the 10th day before the wedding, Vanessa Whitmore had decided the maid was a problem, even though she still didn't fully understand why. It wasn't jealousy in any romantic sense. The idea that Ethan Cole might be interested in household staff hadn't even crossed her mind yet. It was something simpler and more instinctive. Eleanor's sudden closeness with Maria Alvarez felt like a variable Vanessa hadn't accounted for, and Vanessa did not tolerate unaccounted-for variables. She began, quietly, to make Maria's life harder. It started small enough to be deniable. Vanessa requested, through the house manager, never directly, that Maria be assigned additional duties on top of her responsibilities to Eleanor. Laundry for 3 extra guest suites, polishing silver for an event that hadn't been scheduled yet, reorganizing the wine cellar, a task that required climbing narrow stairs dozens of times a day. The house manager, uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge the future Mrs. Cole, simply passed the instructions along. Maria didn't complain. She never complained. She woke earlier, stayed later, and somehow still made it to Eleanor's room every afternoon with tea, served exactly the way the older woman liked it. Strong, a little too hot, with a single spoon of honey stirred counterclockwise. A small detail Maria noticed and remembered without being told twice. Eleanor noticed the exhaustion Maria was trying to hide. She noticed the faint shadows under her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly by late afternoon from carrying too much for too many hours. "Who assigned you all this extra work?" Eleanor asked one afternoon, watching Maria set down the tray with slightly less grace than usual. "It's fine," Maria said. "I don't mind." "That isn't what I asked." Maria hesitated, and in that hesitation, Eleanor had her answer. She said nothing to Vanessa directly. Not yet. Eleanor was patient in a way that made her dangerous. Instead, she began paying even closer attention, watching not just Maria, but the entire ecosystem of small cruelties and small kindnesses moving through her grandson's household like currents beneath still water. It was during this stretch of exhausting days that Maria, while dusting the study Eleanor used for reading, knocked a stack of old photo albums from a high shelf. She apologized instinctively, already crouching to gather the scattered pages, when one loose photograph slid out from between 2 album pages and landed face up on the carpet. Maria froze. The photograph showed 2 young women standing outside a hospital building, both in nurses' uniforms, arms linked, laughing at something outside the frame. One of them Maria didn't recognize. The other one made her stomach drop. It was her mother, younger than Maria had ever seen her in any photo at home, but unmistakably, achingly, her mother's face, her mother's exact smile. Maria stared at it for a long moment before carefully placing it back inside the album, telling herself it must be a coincidence, a resemblance, nothing more. Her mother had worked for many families over the years. It was possible their paths had crossed a hospital hallway decades ago and meant nothing, but she couldn't stop thinking about it. That night, lying awake in the staff quarters, Maria found herself wondering, for the first time since arriving at the Cole estate, why does Eleanor Cole know my mother's face? She didn't yet know that 4 days later, Eleanor would nearly die in front of her, and that the moment would answer far more questions than it created. On the 8th day before the wedding, Eleanor Cole collapsed. It happened in the late afternoon, in the small sitting room off her private study, while Maria was pouring tea. One moment, Eleanor was mid-sentence, asking Maria something about the honey, whether she'd found more at the market, since the last jar was running low, and the next, her words slurred into something unintelligible. Her right hand went slack, and the teacup she'd been reaching for slipped and shattered on the floor. Maria's medical training, dormant for 3 years, activated before her conscious mind hadn't even caught up. She was on her knees beside Eleanor in an instant, noting the drooping left side of her face, the confusion in her eyes, the way she couldn't lift her right arm when Maria asked her to. Stroke. Every symptom lined up exactly the way it had in her textbooks, exactly the way she'd been trained to recognize in her clinical rotations, before everything fell apart. "Someone call an ambulance, now!" Maria shouted toward the hallway, her voice sharper and more commanding than anyone in that house had ever heard from her. She kept Eleanor upright, but tilted slightly, checking her airway, timing the symptoms, speaking calmly and clearly to the older woman even as panic exploded through the rest of the house. "Eleanor, I need you to stay with me. Can you squeeze my hand? Good, good. Stay right here." By the time paramedics arrived 11 minutes later, Maria had already given them a precise, clinical timeline. Onset time, symptom progression, vital signs she'd checked manually with the composure of someone who had done this before. Because she had, countless times, during her mother's illness and during her own truncated training. The lead paramedic actually paused and asked her, "Are you a nurse?" "I was in medical school," Maria said quietly. Before, Ethan arrived at the hospital 40 minutes later, having been in a meeting across the city when the call came. He walked into the waiting room to find his grandmother stable, in early treatment. The doctor's already confident about a strong recovery, specifically because, as the attending physician told him directly, whoever was with her when it happened recognized the symptoms immediately and got her here inside the golden hour. That made all the difference. Ethan asked who had been with her. The answer was Maria. He found her sitting alone in the hallway outside Eleanor's room, still in her staff uniform, hands folded tightly in her lap, looking exhausted and frightened, in a way that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with genuine fear for a woman she had grown, in a matter of weeks, to quietly care for. "Thank you," Ethan said. It came out rougher than he intended, thick with an emotion he didn't often let people see. "The doctor said if you hadn't caught it that fast." "I just did what anyone would do," Maria said. "That's not true. Most people wouldn't have known what they were looking at." Maria didn't answer that. She wasn't ready to explain the medical degree she'd never finished, the mother she'd lost, the years she didn't talk about. Ethan didn't push, but for the first time in 11 months, he actually looked at her, not through her, the way he looked at furniture and hallways and the 100 small conveniences that kept his enormous house running, but at her, and something about the exhaustion and quiet strength in her face stayed with him longer than he expected. 3 days later, once Eleanor was stable and resting at home under a private nurse's care, she called her personal assistant into her study and closed the door. "I know now," Eleanor said, her speech still slightly careful from the stroke, but her mind as sharp as ever. "It's decided." "What's decided, ma'am?" Eleanor didn't answer directly. She simply asked her assistant to retrieve a locked box from the back of her closet, one that hadn't been opened in longer than the assistant had worked for the family, and to bring it to her privately and to tell absolutely no one. The assistant did as asked, and later in the staff break room, mentioned in passing that Eleanor had said something odd about a decision being made. The comment traveled, as things do in large households, until it reached Vanessa Whitmore's ears within the hour. Vanessa's stomach turned cold. Whatever this decision was, she was suddenly, deeply certain it had nothing to do with her. That night, alone in her study with the locked box open on the desk in front of her, Eleanor Cole finally allowed herself to look, fully and without flinching, at the truth she had carried for 40 years. Inside the box was a nurse's badge with the name R. Alvarez, engraved on brass gone dull with age, a folded newspaper clipping, brittle at the creases, and a single photograph, the twin of the one that had slipped from the album days earlier, except this one had never been placed in any album. Eleanor had kept it separate, apart, private, for 4 decades. She was 29 years old in that photograph. Rosa Alvarez was 24. The story the newspaper clipping hinted at, and the box's contents confirmed in full, was one Eleanor had never told a single living soul. Not her husband before he passed, not her son, not Ethan. 40 years earlier, before the Cole fortune existed in anything close to its current form, a much younger Eleanor had been involved in a car accident on a rain-soaked road outside the city, an accident that, due to circumstances Eleanor had spent decades trying to forget, was never fully reported the way it should have been. She had been driving. She had been drinking, only slightly, only enough that in the panic of the moment, she made a choice she was never proud of. She left the scene before authorities arrived, terrified of what a scandal would do to her young family, to her husband's fragile new business, to everything everything they were building. She nearly bled to death in her own home that night, having driven herself back rather than risk a hospital admission that would raise questions. It was Rosa Alvarez, a young night nurse working a private case 2 houses down, called over in a desperate, whispered emergency by a terrified household maid, who found Eleanor collapsed in her bathroom, recognized the severity of her internal injuries, and made a decision that could have ended Rosa's entire career. She treated Eleanor privately, stabilized her using equipment quietly borrowed from the hospital, and never once reported what she strongly suspected, that the injuries hadn't come from a simple fall as Eleanor claimed, but from something far more serious that Eleanor never fully explained. Rosa saved her life, and Rosa kept her secret, for nothing in return except Eleanor's tearful, desperate promise that night. "I will never forget this. I will find a way to repay you, whatever it costs me." But life moved forward the way it does. Eleanor's family grew wealthy. Rosa moved twice for work, then a third time, and eventually the two women lost contact entirely, the way people do when decades and different worlds pull them apart. Eleanor searched for her twice over the years, quietly, without success, and eventually convinced herself Rosa must have wanted nothing more to do with a family built partly on a secret Rosa alone had carried. Until 11 months ago, when a young woman with a familiar face and an unfamiliar name started working in her grandson's house. Eleanor hadn't been certain, not at first. Faces change, memories fade, coincidences happen. But the mother's name, spoken quietly over afternoon tea, had confirmed what her instincts already suspected, and the stroke, the terrifying, humbling irony of it, had confirmed something even larger. History, it seemed, was determined to repeat itself. A young woman with medical instincts had once again appeared exactly when Eleanor needed saving, exactly the way her mother had decades before. Eleanor closed the box and sat in the dark for a long time. The debt she owed wasn't to be repaid with money. Money, she had come to understand over 82 years of life, rarely fixed the things that actually mattered. What she owed Rosa Alvarez, what she now, by extension, owed Rosa's daughter, was something rarer. A chance. A door opened, instead of one that had been closed by circumstance and grief. She had decided, in that hospital hallway 3 days earlier, while doctors worked to save her life, exactly what she would do with whatever time she had left. She would give her grandson the one thing he had never truly had in his guarded, calculated, carefully managed life. A choice made from love instead of leverage. What Eleanor didn't yet know was that somewhere in her own house, a private investigator hired by a desperate, frightened young woman was already digging into exactly the same buried history, and was about to find it for reasons far less noble than Eleanor's own. Vanessa's private investigator, a methodical man named Grant Pierce who had built a career finding exactly the kind of information wealthy families paid handsomely to keep buried, started with what should have been a simple job: dig up dirt on a household maid. What he found instead cracked open something far bigger than he, or Vanessa, had bargained for. The surface-level report came back within 4 days. Maria Alvarez, 29, former medical student at a respected university, withdrawn during her final year following the death of her mother, Rosa Alvarez, from pancreatic cancer. Significant medical debt, no criminal record, no scandals, nothing Vanessa could use to have Maria dismissed or discredited in any conventional sense. Vanessa was furious reading it. "She's clean," she snapped at Grant over the phone. "There's nothing here." "There's one more thread," Grant said carefully. "The mother's employment history. I found something strange in an old hospital staffing archive. I think you'll want to see it before I close this file." What Grant had found, buried in a digitized hospital record from Street, Agnes decades earlier, was a staffing note referencing an unofficial private nursing arrangement, a name crossed out and rewritten twice in the margins, a payment that didn't match any billed procedure, and a notation in a supervisor's handwriting, E. Cole, private matter, do not file. Grant, thorough as ever, cross-referenced the initials against Cole family records from the same era and found what should have been impossible to find: a young Eleanor Cole, hospitalized privately, off the books. On the exact same date, Rosa Alvarez's staffing record showed an unexplained absence from her assigned patient. He laid it all out for Vanessa in a private meeting 2 days later, sliding printed pages across the table between them. "I don't know exactly what happened 40 years ago," Grant said, But I know Eleanor Cole was involved in something she didn't want documented, and I know Rosa Alvarez was the one who handled it. Whatever it was, Eleanor Cole has apparently never forgotten it. Vanessa stared at the pages for a long time, her mind working faster than it had in weeks. This wasn't dirt on Maria. This was leverage on Eleanor. And leverage, Vanessa had learned from a lifetime spent watching her own family navigate financial ruin with practiced smiles, was worth infinitely more than dirt. She sat back in her chair, and for the first time in this entire ordeal, she smiled a real smile. "Destroy the Maid's file," she told Grant. "I don't need it anymore. I need something else from you now. I need you to help me have a private conversation with Eleanor Cole. One she won't be able to walk away from." Grant hesitated. Blackmailing an 82-year-old woman recovering from a stroke was a different category of work than digging up a maid's academic transcripts, and even a man like Grant had lines he didn't cross casually. "This isn't what I signed up for," he said. "You signed up to do whatever I need done," Vanessa said, "and you'll be paid whatever it costs to make you comfortable with that." Grant took the money, but something in him, a small, uncomfortable seed of conscience he hadn't expected to feel in this line of work, didn't sit right with what he'd just agreed to. He kept a copy of everything he found. A full copy, backed up, dated, time-stamped. Just in case, he told himself. Just in case this went somewhere he'd eventually need to prove he'd tried to do the right thing. He had no idea how soon that just in case would arrive. Meanwhile, Maria remained completely unaware that a stranger had spent 4 days investigating her mother's death, her medical debt, her entire shattered life, and had walked away deciding none of it mattered as much as a decades-old hospital record that had nothing to do with her at all. The storm building around her had almost nothing to do with anything she had done. That, in itself, was about to become the cruelest part of everything that followed. The confrontation happened 4 days before the wedding, in Eleanor's private study, behind a closed door that muffled almost everything except the sharpest edges of raised voices. Vanessa had requested the meeting under the pretense of finalizing wedding details. Eleanor, still moving carefully after her stroke but mentally undiminished, agreed to see her, curious what excuse Vanessa would manufacture for a private audience so close to the ceremony. She got her answer within the first 2 minutes. "I know about St. Agnes," Vanessa said, sliding a folder across the desk. "I know about the accident. I know what Rosa Alvarez did for you, and I know you've never told anyone. Not Diane, not Ethan, no one." Eleanor didn't flinch. 40 years of carrying a secret had taught her exactly how to keep her face still, even when her heart was pounding. "And what exactly do you think you're going to do with that?" Eleanor asked. "I think," Vanessa said, leaning forward, "that you're going to choose me. Publicly, at the rehearsal dinner, exactly as planned. And this folder disappears. Or I make sure every gossip column and every one of Ethan's business partners hears that the beloved Cole family matriarch has spent 40 years hiding a hit and run and a cover-up. How do you think that plays for a company built on trust and reputation, Eleanor?" For a long moment, Eleanor said nothing. Then, quietly, she began to laugh. Not hysterically, but with the exhausted, almost relieved laughter of someone who has been dreading a moment for so long that its actual arrival feels almost like release. "You think I'm afraid of that story getting out?" Eleanor said. "Child, I have spent 40 years afraid of it. Do you have any idea how tired a person gets, carrying something that heavy for that long?" Vanessa's confidence flickered, just slightly. "Go ahead," Eleanor continued. "Print it. Tell every reporter you can find. Let the whole world know that an old woman made a terrible mistake 4 decades ago, and a braver, better woman saved her and asked for nothing in return." Her voice hardened. "But understand this. The story you'd be telling isn't the scandal you think it is. It's the story of exactly why I owe Rosa Alvarez's daughter more than a job cleaning silverware in my grandson's house. You'd be handing me the exact justification I need to do precisely what I've already decided to do." "Oh." Vanessa stood frozen, her carefully constructed leverage crumbling in real time. "You're bluffing," she said. "I am 82 years old, and I have already survived worse than gossip," Eleanor said calmly. "Are you certain you want to find out if I'm bluffing?" Vanessa left the study that afternoon in a controlled panic, her plan in ashes, and did the only thing she could think to do next. She went to the one person in the family whose interests were as tangled up in this marriage as her own. She went to Diane Cole. "I need your help," Vanessa said, sitting across from Ethan's mother in Diane's private sitting room. "Eleanor isn't going to choose me, I know it. And if this marriage collapses, I'm not the only one with something to lose, am I?" Diane's face went pale. "What are you talking about?" "Don't insult me," Vanessa said. "I know about the loan my father's company quietly extended Cole Industries 6 years ago, during the shipping crisis. I know it was never fully repaid in cash. That part of the agreement was always this marriage. Am I wrong?" Diane was silent for a long moment, the silence of someone caught in exactly the corner she'd spent years avoiding. "You're not wrong," she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. For the first time since this entire ordeal began, the audience, and Ethan, was about to learn that the betrayal in this story wasn't only coming from outside his family. It had been sitting inside it the entire time. 2 days before the wedding, Maria found herself walking past Diane Cole's sitting room with a stack of fresh linens when she heard her own mother's name spoken through the partially open door. She froze. Rosa Alvarez saved Eleanor's life 40 years ago, and now Eleanor's decided the daughter deserves some kind of storybook payback, Vanessa's voice said, sharp with frustration. "Meanwhile, you and I are the ones who actually have something real at stake here. Your company's debt to my family. My family's entire future. All of it resting on whether Ethan marries me." "Keep your voice down," Diane hissed. Maria stood in the hallway, linens forgotten in her arms, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain someone would hear it through the wall. Her mother saved Eleanor's life. Eleanor's choice, the tradition, the mysterious announcement, the personal questions, the tea, the recovery, all of it, was about her, about her mother. She didn't fully understand yet what it meant, but she understood enough to feel a wave of nausea and fear roll through her. If this was true, if Eleanor really was considering her, a maid, a stranger to this world, someone with nothing to offer a family like this, except a decades-old debt she hadn't even known existed until this exact moment, then she wasn't just an unlikely footnote in someone else's wedding drama. She was about to become the center of a scandal that could tear a powerful family apart, expose an old woman's darkest secret, and hand ammunition to a woman as ruthless as Vanessa Whitmore. Maria didn't want any of it. She had spent 3 years rebuilding a life out of the wreckage of her mother's death, learning to survive on quiet invisibility, and the last thing she wanted, the very last thing, was to become the reason a billionaire's engagement collapsed into public scandal. That night, alone in her small room in the staff quarters, Maria sat down and wrote a resignation letter. "Dear Mrs. Cole, thank you for everything. I am so grateful for the kindness you've shown me these past months, and I am deeply relieved you are recovering well. I have accepted a position elsewhere and must leave the household immediately. Please don't worry about me. I only ask that you take care of yourself. With love and respect, Maria." She packed a single bag, planning to leave before dawn, before Eleanor's condition even allowed for a difficult conversation, before Ethan noticed she was gone, before Vanessa could turn this discovery into a weapon aimed at the only family who had ever, briefly, made Maria feel like she mattered. She left the letter on the small desk in her room and slipped out into the pre-dawn dark. She never made it past the front gate. Ethan Cole, unable to sleep, restless with a wedding 2 days away that suddenly felt heavier and less certain than it should have, had gone for an early walk around the grounds, a habit from childhood, from summers with his grandmother, when walking helped him think clearer than staring at a ceiling ever did. He found the resignation letter first, actually. He'd stopped by the staff quarters to ask the night manager a question and noticed Maria's door slightly open, the letter visible on the desk in the dim light. Something about the careful, formal wording, the sudden urgency of "must leave immediately," made his stomach twist with an instinct he didn't fully understand yet. He caught up to her at the front gate just as the sky was beginning to lighten, bag over her shoulder, tears she'd been fighting all night finally breaking free. "Maria," Ethan said, breathless from running. "Wait, please." For the first time in his entire life, Ethan Cole, A man who had built an empire chasing certainty, control, and profit margins, found himself chasing something he couldn't quantify, couldn't calculate, and had absolutely no idea how to handle. "I have to go," Maria said, not turning around. "Please, just let me go." "Not until you tell me why," Ethan said. "Not until you tell me what's going on." And finally, exhausted and out of places left to hide, Maria turned around and told him everything. They sat together on the front steps as the sun came up, and Maria told Ethan everything. Her mother, medical school, the debt, the years of quiet survival, the photograph she'd found in the study, and finally, the conversation she'd overheard between Vanessa and Diane the night before. Ethan listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening more with every sentence, something cold and furious building behind his eyes. "You're telling me my mother has been financially indebted to Vanessa's family this entire time," he said slowly, "and that this engagement, my engagement, was arranged, at least in part, to settle that debt." "I didn't want to be the one to tell you this," Maria said quietly. "I never wanted to be part of any of it. I just wanted to work, pay off what I owed, and disappear back into my own life eventually. I'm sorry." "Don't apologize," Ethan said, his voice rough. "You didn't do anything wrong. You've done nothing but work yourself half to death in my house and save my grandmother's life. If anyone owes an apology in this family, it isn't you." He asked her to stay, just for a few more days, just long enough for him to sort out what was actually true. Maria hesitated, but something in his voice, something steadier and more certain than she'd ever heard from him before, convinced her to agree. That same morning, Ethan confronted his mother directly. The conversation in Diane's sitting room lasted nearly 2 hours, and by the end of it, Diane was in tears, finally admitting the full truth she'd spent 6 years burying under polite dinners and careful smiles. "The company almost collapsed during the shipping crisis," Diane said. "You were so deep in the operational side, trying to save the company, you never saw how close we came to losing everything. The Whitmores extended a loan that kept us solvent through the worst quarter. It was never formally tied to marriage. Nobody signed a document saying marry Vanessa or repay this. But the expectation was always there, unspoken, understood. I let it become understood because I was terrified, and because Vanessa's family made it very clear what they expected in return over the years. You let me build a life around a woman you knew I was only with because of a debt I didn't even know existed," Ethan said, his voice shaking with a fury he rarely allowed himself to show. "I told myself you loved her," Diane said, crying openly now. "I told myself it didn't matter how it started, as long as it worked out. I was wrong. I know I was wrong." Ethan left that conversation with his understanding of his own engagement completely upended. What he had believed was his choice, a relationship built on compatibility, on mutual ambition, on the comfortable absence of complications, had, in reality, been quietly engineered around him for years by people who claimed to love him. That evening, he sought out his grandmother. Eleanor, still recovering but sharper than ever, finally told him the entire truth: the accident, the cover-up, Rosa Alvarez, the 40 years of silence, and her decision, made in a hospital hallway while doctors fought to save her life, that Maria deserved a chance her mother's sacrifice had made possible. "I was never going to force anything on you, Ethan," Eleanor said. "I only wanted to give you the truth and let you decide what to do with it, the way your mother should have from the beginning. Whether you choose Maria or not was always going to be your decision. I only wanted you to have all the information Vanessa and your mother tried to keep from you." Ethan sat with his grandmother in silence for a long time, absorbing 4 decades of secrets in a single evening. He already knew, somewhere underneath the shock and anger, exactly what his decision would be. He had known it, honestly, since a hospital hallway 8 days earlier, watching a maid he'd barely noticed for 11 months hold his grandmother's hand and refuse to let her go. The rehearsal dinner took place the following evening, exactly as originally scheduled, in the grand hall of the Cole estate, with 200 guests, a table of press invited under the assumption they'd be documenting a fairy tale society wedding, and Vanessa Whitmore standing at the head table in a dress that had cost more than most people's yearly salary, smiling a smile that didn't yet know it was about to shatter. Earlier that day, Vanessa had made one final desperate move. Unable to force Eleanor's hand and increasingly aware that her leverage had failed, she leaked a fabricated story to a gossip outlet, claiming that Ethan's household maid had seduced him for money and was blackmailing the family to secure a marriage proposal. The story, timed to break the morning of the rehearsal dinner, was designed to destroy Maria's credibility before she could ever become a threat. It backfired more completely than Vanessa could have imagined. Eleanor Cole stood up at the rehearsal dinner, silenced the room with nothing more than the simple act of rising slowly to her feet, and asked for everyone's attention. "There has been a story circulating today about a young woman in this household," Eleanor began, her voice carrying clearly despite her recent illness. "I'd like to tell you the true story instead." What followed was a full, unflinching account. The accident 40 years ago, her own terrible mistake, the young nurse named Rosa Alvarez, who saved her life and asked for nothing, the decades of silence, and finally, her decision to give Rosa's daughter the same grace Rosa had once given her. "And 2 days ago," Eleanor continued, her eyes finding Vanessa across the room, "this same young woman, Vanessa Whitmore, discovered my private history and attempted to blackmail me with it, threatening to expose it publicly unless I chose her as Ethan's bride instead of allowing him to make his own decision." "Ah!" Gasps rippled through the room. Vanessa's face drained of color. "That's a lie," Vanessa said, her voice cracking. "She has no proof of that." It was at that moment that Grant Pierce, standing quietly near the back of the room, invited discreetly by Eleanor's assistant after he'd reached out 2 days earlier, conscience finally winning out over the money he'd already been paid, stepped forward. "I have proof," Grant said, holding up his phone. "I recorded our meeting. I kept a copy of everything because something about what I was being asked to do never sat right with me." The recording, played through the hall's sound system to a stunned, silent room, left absolutely no room for doubt. Vanessa Whitmore's engagement collapsed in front of 200 guests and a table full of press who had come expecting a fairy tale, and instead witnessed a public unraveling. Her family's financial arrangement with Diane, exposed in the same conversation, ended what little remained of the Whitmore family's standing in social circles that valued discretion above almost everything else. Business partners who had quietly tolerated the Whitmores' declining fortune for the sake of the Cole connection distanced themselves within days. The fabricated story about Maria, thoroughly disproven and traced directly back to Vanessa, resulted in a swift, humiliating retraction from the outlet that had published it, and a reputation Vanessa would spend years trying, and largely failing, to repair. She left the estate that night alone, her carefully constructed future dissolved in the span of a single dinner, undone not by anyone else's cruelty, but by the exact same instinct for leverage and manipulation she had relied on her entire life. Diane Cole, humiliated but finally honest, stayed. Ethan, though furious, chose in the days that followed to work through his anger with his mother, rather than cut her off entirely, a decision Eleanor quietly encouraged, reminding him that forgiveness, given honestly and not as weakness, was the only thing that had ever allowed their own fractured family to survive this long. The wedding took place 3 days later than originally planned, in the same grand hall, with far fewer guests but far more genuine joy than the version that had almost happened instead. Ethan Cole stood at the altar, not in a tailored suit chosen by a wedding planner working from Vanessa's vision, but in something simpler, something that felt like his own. When Maria walked down the aisle, she wore a wedding dress that made her stop mid-step, tears already falling before she'd even reached him. Eleanor revealed, quietly, before the ceremony began, that she had commissioned the dress weeks earlier, before the theft accusation, before the blackmail, before Ethan had ever consciously realized his own feelings. She had known somehow from that very first afternoon of careful questions over tea exactly where the story was going to end. "I didn't choose Maria because I owed her mother," Eleanor told Ethan privately, moments before the ceremony. "I chose her because I watched who she was when she thought no one important was paying attention. That told me everything I needed to know." Maria stood at the altar holding Ethan's hands, thinking of her mother, of the sacrifices, the debt, the dream of medicine that had been set aside but never fully extinguished. Ethan had already quietly arranged, without asking for thanks, to fund the remainder of her medical education, insisting it wasn't charity but simply correcting an unfairness the world had handed her too young. "Your mother saved my grandmother's life 40 years ago," Ethan told her, "and never asked for anything in return. I'm not interested in repeating that mistake. You're going to finish what you started, Maria, whatever that takes." Maria cried through most of the ceremony, not from sadness, but from the strange, overwhelming relief of watching a life she'd quietly given up on begin to rebuild itself in front of her. In the audience, Grant Pierce sat near the back, having been invited personally by Eleanor as a thank you for his honesty when it would have been easier and more profitable to stay silent. Diane Cole sat in the front row beside her son, her relationship with him still healing, still imperfect, but honest now in a way it hadn't been in years. And honesty, as Eleanor had always believed, was the only foundation strong enough to actually hold a family together. Vanessa Whitmore was, by then, 3 states away, quietly rebuilding a life stripped of the assumptions she'd spent years relying on, learning, slowly, painfully, the way people sometimes only learn. That leverage built on other people's secrets always eventually turns and finds its way back to the person who wielded it. At the reception, Eleanor Cole raised a glass, her hand steadier now than it had been in weeks, and offered the only toast the evening needed. 40 years ago, a young nurse taught me that the truth, however heavy, is always lighter than the lie you'd have to carry instead. I spent 4 decades learning to carry that truth quietly. Today, I finally got to set it down, by giving her daughter the life her sacrifice made possible. She looked at Ethan and Maria standing together, hands intertwined. Some debts aren't paid back in money. They're paid back in the chances we give the people who come after. The room rose to their feet, glasses lifted, and somewhere in that applause, Maria Alvarez, once invisible, once certain her story had already ended, finally allowed herself to believe that some stories don't end where you think they will. Sometimes they simply wait, quietly, for the right person to finally notice they were never over at all.
Moral of the story teaches us that true character is measured not by wealth, status, or appearance, but by kindness, honesty, and selfless actions. Maria, despite facing hardship, losing her mother, and giving up her dream of becoming a doctor, continued to help others without expecting anything in return. Her compassion and courage eventually changed her life. On the other hand, Vanessa's greed, manipulation, and dishonesty led to her downfall, proving that selfishness and deceit can never bring lasting happiness or success. Eleanor's decision reminds us that gratitude should never be forgotten and that good deeds always leave a lasting impact, even after many years. The story also shows the importance of telling the truth, accepting responsibility for our mistakes, and giving people the opportunities they deserve. In the end, love, integrity, forgiveness, and genuine kindness triumph over greed, lies, and selfish ambition, proving that goodness is always rewarded in one way or another.